March 19th, 1945. 11:23 in the morning. The town of Remagen on the western bank of the Rhine River lies beneath a pale gray sky that threatens rain but delivers only a cold, persistent wind. The Ludendorff Bridge, the last intact crossing over the Rhine, has been in American hands for 11 days now, and the final collapse of the Third Reich is measured not in months, but in weeks. In a makeshift holding area near a bombed-out schoolhouse, 14-year-old Klaus Dietrich Miller sits with his back against a shattered wall, his Wehrmacht uniform hanging from his thin shoulders like a costume several sizes too large. The uniform was issued to him 9 days ago. The rifle he carried was taken from him 3 hours ago. The boy's hands, still soft with childhood, tremble not from cold but from a terror he cannot name. Beside him sit 11 other boys, none older than 16, all members of a hastily assembled Volkssturm unit that existed for exactly 72 hours before surrendering to the American 9th Armored Division without firing a shot. Klaus Miller has been told many things about Americans. He has been told they are mongrels, a degenerate race polluted by Jewish influence and African blood. He has been told that Black American soldiers in particular are subhuman savages, criminals released from prisons and given weapons, men who will torture and mutilate any German they capture. In approximately 4 minutes, a supply truck carrying 3 African-American quartermaster soldiers will pull into this holding area. What happens next will dismantle 12 years of ideological education in the span of a single afternoon. Klaus Miller does not know it yet, but he is about to meet Sergeant William J. Patterson of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company, a 31-year-old man from Birmingham, Alabama, who will offer him a chocolate bar and speak to him in broken German learned from a phrase book. And in that moment, the entire architecture of Nazi racial ideology will begin to collapse inside the mind of a child soldier who has never, until this morning, seen a black person in his life. The story of these encounters, repeated thousands of times across the crumbling Western Front in the spring of 1945, represents one of the most psychologically significant and least examined chapters of the Second World War. To understand why the meeting between German child soldiers and African-American GIs carried such explosive ideological weight, one must first understand what these children had been taught and the desperate circumstances that placed rifles in their hands. By early 1945, Nazi Germany faced a catastrophic manpower shortage. The Wehrmacht had suffered approximately 4 million casualties on the Eastern Front alone. The pool of military-age men had been depleted to the point where Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and commander of the replacement army, authorized the conscription of boys as young as 14 and men as old as 60 into the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, established by Hitler's decree on September 25th, 1944. These were not volunteer units of patriotic youth eager for glory. Records from the period, many now housed in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, reveal a different picture entirely. These were school children pulled from classrooms, given 2 to 3 days of rudimentary weapons training, handed rifles older than their fathers, and sent to defend positions against the most powerful military force the world had ever assembled. Historian Gerhard Rempel, in his definitive study Hitler's Children, the Hitler Youth and the SS, documents that by April 1945, boys as young as 12 were engaged in combat operations in Berlin. The psychological manipulation required to send children to die against tanks and artillery had been underway for more than a decade. The Hitler Youth Organization, established in 1926 and made compulsory for all German children aged 10 to 18 in 1936, served as the primary vehicle for this indoctrination. By the time Klaus Miller and boys like him were handed weapons in March 1945, They had spent their entire conscious lives marinating in Nazi racial ideology. The Rassenkunde, or racial science curriculum, was not a peripheral subject, but a cornerstone of Nazi education. Children learned to categorize humanity into a hierarchy, with the Aryan race at the apex, and all others arranged beneath in descending order of supposed value. Slavic peoples were classified as Untermenschen, subhuman suitable only for labor or extermination. Jews were portrayed as parasites, a biological threat to be eradicated. And black people, particularly black Americans, occupied a unique position in this ideological framework, one built on layers of propaganda specifically designed to undermine America's moral authority. Nazi propagandists, under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, had constructed an elaborate mythology around African Americans, drawing on American segregation as evidence of black inferiority even by American standards. Nazi publications portrayed black soldiers as primitive warriors barely capable of following orders, men driven by animal instincts rather than military discipline. The Völkischer Beobachter, the official Nazi Party newspaper, regularly featured cartoons depicting black American soldiers as ape-like figures. School children were shown newsreels and photographs carefully selected to reinforce these images. When American jazz music was banned as Neger Musik, degenerate Negro music, children were taught that its rhythms were designed to corrupt Aryan youth. By 1945, the average German teenager had never spoken to a black person, never seen one in any context other than propaganda, and had been systematically trained to view them as something less than human. This is what 14-year-old Klaus Miller carried in his mind when the supply truck arrived at the Remagen holding area at 11:27 on that March morning. The first indication that something was wrong with everything Klaus Miller believed came not from what he saw, but from what he heard. Or rather, what he did not hear. He had been told that black American soldiers communicated in grunts and primitive sounds. Instead, he heard English, spoken with an accent he did not recognize but unmistakably a language, flowing and structured. He heard laughter. And then he heard something impossible. One of the black soldiers was singing, softly, under his breath, a melody that Klaus would later learn was a hymn, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, a song from a spiritual tradition older than the nation that had enslaved and then freed the men who sang it. The soldier singing was Private First Class Jerome Washington, 19 years old, from Macon, Georgia. They expected to find savages. Instead, they encountered men. Sergeant William Patterson stepped down from the truck and surveyed the group of child prisoners. According to post-war testimonies collected by American military historians and now preserved in the National Archives, Patterson's first words, spoken in heavily accented German, were, "Habt ihr Hunger? Are you hungry?" The question itself was a violation of everything these boys had been taught. The idea that a black man would offer food to a German, that he would speak German, that he would look at them with what appeared to be concern rather than hatred, created a cognitive rupture that many would describe decades later as the moment their worldview began to crack. Document after document from this period reveals the profound disorientation these encounters produced. In 1998, the German journalist Jürgen Thorwald interviewed surviving members of various Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units for a project on child soldiers. Klaus Dietrich Miller, then 67 years old and living in Munich, described the moment Sergeant Patterson handed him a Hershey's chocolate bar. "I thought it must be poisoned," Miller recalled. "We had been told they would do this, trick us with poisoned food or candy. But then I watched him take a bite from his own bar, and he smiled at me, and I saw his teeth, and they were just teeth, not the fangs we had been shown in the pictures. I remember thinking that his teeth looked like my father's teeth. That was the thought that broke something in me. His teeth looked like my father's teeth." The psychological literature on cognitive dissonance describes what happened next in clinical terms. When deeply held beliefs are confronted with irrefutable contradictory evidence, the mind enters a state of distress that can only be resolved by either rejecting the evidence or revising the belief. For these child soldiers, starving, terrified, and witnessing with their own eyes the humanity of those they had been taught to view as animals, revision was the only possible outcome. Private First Class Jerome Washington, the soldier who had been singing, noticed a boy of perhaps 15 staring at him with an expression Washington later described to his family as like he was seeing a ghost. Washington walked over to the boy, whose name was Hans Peter Vogel, and knelt down to his level. He reached into his pocket and produced a photograph, a picture of his mother, standing in front of their church in Macon. Washington pointed to the woman in the photograph and said, "Mama." Hans Peter Vogel, who would survive the war and eventually become a Lutheran minister in Hamburg, wrote in his 1987 memoir From Hitler's Shadow, "In that instant, I understood that this man had a mother who loved him. And if he had a mother who loved him, then he was not an animal. And if he was not an animal, then everything I had been told was a lie. And if everything I had been told was a lie, then what else had they lied about?" The evidence of these transformative encounters is preserved not only in personal testimonies, but in official military records. The 39 16th Quartermaster Truck Company, an all-black unit assigned to supply operations following the Allied advance into Germany, processed thousands of prisoners in the spring of 1945. The unit's commanding officer, Captain Harold T. Phelps, a white officer in accordance with the Army's segregated structure, noted in his after-action reports a surprising pattern. German prisoners, particularly the youngest ones, displayed what he termed unexpected docility when handled by African-American personnel. Phelps, writing in April 1945, observed, "The German boys seem almost relieved to discover that our colored soldiers are ordinary men." Several have commented that they were told to expect atrocities. When kindness is shown instead, their entire demeanor changes. This kindness was not accidental. It was, in many cases, a deliberate choice made by black soldiers who understood exactly what they represented in this moment. Sergeant Patterson, in a letter to his wife transcribed in a collection maintained by the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, wrote, "These German boys look at me like I am some kind of monster. And I know what they have been taught. But I also know what I am. I am a man. I am a soldier. I am an American. And if I treat them with cruelty, I become what they think I am. But if I treat them with dignity, I prove their whole system wrong. That is a kind of victory no bullet can win." The contrast between expectation and reality extended beyond personal interactions to material abundance. These child soldiers, many of whom had been subsisting on reduced rations for months, encountered in American captivity a level of food and resources that seemed almost supernatural. Here, the symbol that would come to represent the collapse of Nazi ideology was not a weapon or a flag, but something far more humble. A chocolate bar. The Hershey's chocolate bar, specifically the field ration D bar designed to sustain soldiers in the field, became for many German prisoners their first concrete evidence of American industrial and agricultural power. To a boy who had not tasted chocolate in 2 years, who had been told that America was a decadent, crumbling society on the verge of collapse, the simple act of being handed chocolate by a black soldier represented an irrefutable argument. If America was dying, as the propaganda claimed, why did its soldiers have chocolate to give away? If black Americans were inferior, incapable of complex tasks, why were they operating trucks, managing supply chains, and speaking multiple languages? The chocolate bar, small and wrapped in its brown paper, became a philosophical object. a refutation in confectionery form. The records show that German prisoners frequently asked where the chocolate came from. When told it was produced in factories in Pennsylvania by workers who included Black Americans and shipped across an ocean controlled by the American Navy, the ideological implications were inescapable. The very existence of that chocolate bar in that place at that time, handed from that hand to this one, proved that everything they had been taught about American weakness and racial hierarchy was fiction. Hans Peter Vogel, the boy who had seen Jerome Washington's photograph of his mother, wrote that the chocolate became a symbol he carried through his entire life. I kept the wrapper, he wrote in his memoir. I kept it in a drawer for 50 years. Whenever I began to believe something simply because an authority figure told me to believe it, I would take out that wrapper and remember. I would remember how easily I had believed lies. And I would ask myself, what am I failing to question today? The transformation that occurred in these encounters was not instantaneous, nor was it universal. Some boys, particularly those older ones more thoroughly indoctrinated, resisted the evidence of their senses. But for the youngest, those 14 and 15-year-olds who had been given rifles before they had finished childhood, the encounter with Black American soldiers initiated a process of ideological unraveling that would continue for years. What happened to these boys after the war illuminates the lasting impact of these moments. Klaus Dietrich Miller, who received the chocolate bar from Sergeant Patterson, returned to school in 1946 under the Allied denazification program. He became a teacher himself, eventually serving as headmaster of a secondary school in Bavaria. In interviews conducted late in his life, Miller was explicit about the connection between his encounter with Black GIs and his subsequent career. I became a teacher because I understood at 14 years old how easily children can be made to believe lies. I spent my career trying to teach young people to question, to demand evidence, to never accept ideology as truth. I trace this directly to March 19th, 1945. I trace this directly to a Black man from Alabama who gave me chocolate and asked if I was hungry. Hans Peter Vogel, the future minister who saw the photograph of Jerome Washington's mother, made a pilgrimage to Macon, Georgia in 1972. With help from veterans organizations, he located the Washington family. Jerome Washington had died in 1968, but his mother, the woman in the photograph, was still alive. Vogel stood in front of the same church depicted in the photograph, now elderly himself, and wept. He later wrote, "I had come to apologize for what I had been taught to think, to apologize for what my country had done. But Mrs. Washington simply took my hands and said, 'You were a child. Children believe what they are told. The sin belongs to those who told you.'" The larger implications of these encounters extend beyond individual transformations. Historians of post-war Germany, including Robert G. Mueller and Norbert Frey, have documented how the collapse of Nazi racial ideology, experienced viscerally by millions of Germans through direct contact with those they had been taught to despise, contributed to the broader process of denazification. This is not to suggest that racist attitudes disappeared overnight, nor that Germany's reckoning with its past was complete or uncomplicated, but the specific encounter between German child soldiers and Black American GIs represents a concentrated moment of ideological collapse, documented in testimony after testimony, that deserves recognition. Years later, Sergeant William Patterson, who had survived the war and returned to Birmingham to work as a postal carrier, was asked by a local newspaper reporter if he had any particular memories from his service in Germany. Patterson, by then in his 60s, described the day at Remagen when he had handed chocolate to a group of frightened boys. "Those children looked at me like I was the devil himself," Patterson said. "And then I gave them chocolate, And I saw something change in their eyes. I saw them start to think. And I realized that maybe that was the most important thing I did in the whole war. Not driving trucks, not moving supplies, but letting those boys see that their whole belief system was built on sand. I showed them, just by being a decent human being, that everything Hitler told them was wrong. Perhaps what makes these encounters so significant is not merely their historical importance, but their enduring relevance. The machinery of dehumanization, of teaching children to view other human beings as less than human, did not disappear with the fall of the Third Reich. It has reappeared in different forms in every subsequent generation. But the antidote, as these encounters demonstrate, remains the same. It is not argument or education or policy, although all these have their place. The antidote is encounter. It is the moment when ideology meets flesh, when propaganda confronts a human face, when a child who has been taught to hate sees the enemy smile and offer food. In the end, what Sergeant Patterson and Private Washington and the other African-American soldiers of the 39th 16th Quartermaster Truck Company accomplished was a form of victory that no battlefield could have provided. They dismantled one chocolate bar at a time, one photograph at a time, one moment of human kindness at a time, an ideology built on the premise that some human beings are not fully human. They did this not with weapons, but with presence. They did this not with force, but with grace. And they did this while fighting for a country that did not yet recognize their own full humanity. A country that would send them home to segregated buses and colored only drinking fountains and the continuing denial of their rights as citizens. That is perhaps the most profound irony preserved in these records. Black American soldiers, men who experienced racism daily in their own nation, became the instruments of anti-racist revelation for German children, raised on the most virulent racial ideology in modern history. They demonstrated, through their conduct, a moral authority that transcended their nation's failure to honor it. They showed German teenagers that human dignity is not contingent on ideology, that kindness is possible between those taught to hate each other, that the lies we are fed as children can be dissolved by the simple, overwhelming evidence of a human being refusing to be less than human. March 19th, 1945. A black man from Birmingham hands a chocolate bar to a white child from Stuttgart. The child takes a bite. The chocolate is sweet, and something fundamental in the architecture of hate begins, silently, irreversibly, to crumble. Decades later, Klaus Dietrich Miller, the boy who had trembled against that shattered wall, would be asked what he thought of when he thought of the war. He did not speak of battles or defeats or the collapse of his nation. He spoke of a chocolate bar. I remember the taste, he said. I remember thinking that if the enemy could be this kind, then perhaps there were no enemies at all. Perhaps there were only people told different lies by different leaders. And perhaps the only way out for any of us was to stop believing the lies and to look, truly look, at the human being standing in front of you. That is the lesson that Remagen offers. That is what those encounters, repeated thousands of times in the chaotic spring of 1945, still teach. It is not a lesson about war. It is a lesson about what comes after. It is a lesson about how quickly hatred can be taught and how simply, in the presence of undeniable humanity, it can be unlearned. And somewhere in a drawer in Bavaria, a Hershey's wrapper, folded and worn, waited for 50 years to remind an old man of the day he stopped believing in monsters and began, finally, to believe in men.